In the pre-dawn darkness of what we now call the Mississippi River Valley, a woman known only as the Seed Keeper pressed her weathered hands against clay vessels that held more than seeds, they held the future itself. The year was 1490, and she carried a burden that would crush most souls. If she died, entire nations would starve. Her calloused fingers traced the rim of a sacred pot, containing kernels of the three sisters' corn, beans, and squash varieties that had taken centuries to perfect. Each seed represented countless generations of careful selection, patient cultivation, and accumulated wisdom. But tonight, as the first frost of winter touched the earth, she felt the weight of something far heavier than knowledge. She felt the weight of time running out. The Seed Keeper was not her birth name, but it had become her identity so completely that even she had forgotten what her mother once called her. For 37 years, she had served as the living library of her people, memorizing not just which seeds to plant, but when, where, and how. She knew the 17 different varieties of corn in her care, each adapted to specific soil conditions and weather patterns. She understood the precise timing needed for beans to climb corn stalks without strangling them. She carried in her mind the knowledge of which squash varieties could survive the harshest droughts and which thrived in flood years. But knowledge without a successor is merely borrowed time. As autumn deepened into the cruel grip of early winter, the Seed Keeper faced a crisis that kept her awake through the long, cold nights. Her apprentice had died of fever 3 moons ago. The young woman who was supposed to inherit this vast repository of agricultural wisdom, generations of trial and error, success and failure, abundance and famine, was gone. And the Seed Keeper was running out of time to find a replacement. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Her people depended on crops that fed not just their own families, but trade networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The surplus from their fields supported craftsmen, priests, builders, and warriors. Without her seeds, without her knowledge, the complex society that had taken centuries to build would collapse within a single generation. She moved through her storage chambers like a ghost haunting her own future. Hundreds of clay vessels lined the underground rooms, each one carefully labeled with markings that only she could fully interpret. Here were the seeds that produced corn with kernels large enough to feed a family for days. There were the beans that fixed nitrogen in the soil, ensuring fertility for future crops. And in the corner, protected by layers of bark and hide, were the emergency reserve seeds saved from the best harvests of the past 5 years, insurance against the inevitable bad seasons. But insurance meant nothing if there was no one left who knew how to use it. The Seed Keeper had spent weeks trying to identify potential successors among the younger women of her community. Each candidate brought different strengths. Some had keen memories, others showed natural intuition with growing things. But none possessed the combination of intellectual capacity, emotional stability, and deep patience required for the role. The responsibility demanded someone who could think in decades, not seasons. Someone who could resist the temptation to use emergency stores during merely difficult times, saving them for true catastrophe. Someone who could make the hard choice to let people go hungry in a poor year, rather than risk future famine by depleting reserves. As winter deepened, the Seed Keeper realized she was facing the one scenario her predecessors had never adequately prepared for: the complete loss of institutional memory within a single generation. The knowledge she carried was not simply about agriculture, it was about survival at the most fundamental level. She knew which wild plants could supplement diets during lean years, how to process acorns to remove bitter tannins, and where to find medicinal roots that could treat the illnesses that struck when people were weakened by hunger. She understood the delicate balance between exploitation and conservation, knowing exactly how much wild rice could be harvested from each marsh without damaging future yields. Her mind contained detailed maps of seasonal patterns stretching back decades, allowing her to predict which combinations of weather would require which emergency measures. This was the weight that pressed down on her shoulders as she conducted her nightly inspections of the seed stores. Each vessel she checked represented hundreds of hours of careful work, not just her own, but the accumulated labor of countless women who had held this responsibility before her. She was not just a keeper of seeds, she was a guardian of civilization itself. The cold deepened, and with it, the seed keeper's growing desperation. She had begun to consider increasingly drastic measures. Perhaps she could divide the knowledge among several women, each taking responsibility for different crops or different aspects of cultivation. But the interconnections were too complex, the timing too crucial. A mistake in planting sequence could cascade through the entire agricultural system, disrupting not just food production, but the social and economic relationships built around it. She thought about the trading expeditions that would arrive with spring, expecting to exchange exotic goods for surplus corn and beans. These weren't just local transactions, they were part of continent-spanning networks that moved copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Atlantic coast, and obsidian from far western mountains. Her people sat at the center of these networks because their agricultural productivity allowed them to support large populations and generate consistent surpluses. Without her knowledge, that productivity would collapse, taking with it not just local prosperity, but the far-reaching connections that made their world possible. The seed keeper had seen what happened to communities that lost their agricultural knowledge. 40 years ago, a village 3 days' travel downstream had suffered a similar loss when their keeper died suddenly in an accident. Within 5 years, they had abandoned their fields and dispersed, some families joining other communities as laborers, others reverting to hunting and gathering. Their elaborate earthwork monuments still stood, but weeds grew in their ceremonial plazas. Their story served as a constant reminder of how quickly complexity could dissolve into simplicity and prosperity into mere survival. But the seed keepers' community was far larger and more complex than that lost village. The collapse would be proportionally more catastrophic. Thousands of people depended directly on the agricultural system she maintained. Tens of thousands more depended on the trade networks her community's surplus supported. The knowledge she carried wasn't just local, it had implications for food security across much of the continent. As the depths of winter approached, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible months earlier. She would break with tradition and begin training multiple successors simultaneously, even though this violated every protocol her own teacher had drilled into her. The risk of fragmenting the knowledge was real, but it was less dangerous than the certainty of losing it entirely. Working by firelight in the underground chambers, the seed keeper began creating detailed records on bark scrolls, something her predecessors had never done. The knowledge had always been passed down orally, teacher to student, generation to generation. But desperate times required desperate measures. She would create written records as backup, even though she knew that written knowledge was vulnerable in ways that living memory was not. Scrolls could be destroyed by fire or flood. They could be lost or stolen. But they could also preserve information beyond the span of human life. Night after night, she worked to transcribe not just the basic facts which seeds, planted when, in what combinations, but the deeper patterns that took decades to recognize. She wrote about the subtle signs that preceded drought years, the barely perceptible changes in bird behavior that signaled early springs, the particular qualities of soil and weather that produced the best harvests. She documented the exceptions to every rule, the special circumstances that required modified approaches. But as she wrote, the seed keeper realized that codifying the knowledge also diminished it. The intuitive connections, the split-second decisions based on years of observation, the ability to read the land like a familiar face, these couldn't be captured in written form. They required lived experience, the kind of deep familiarity that came only from years of intimate contact with growing things. The training of her successors became a race against time. She identified 3 young women who showed promise and began an intensive program of instruction. But even working from dawn to dusk, she could only cover a fraction of what they needed to know before spring planting began. She found herself forced to prioritize, teaching first the knowledge that was most critical for immediate survival, then layering on the subtleties that made the difference between adequate harvests and abundant ones. Spring arrived earlier than expected, catching the seed keeper in the middle of her desperate education program. The ice broke on the rivers while her students were still learning to distinguish between the 17 varieties of corn in their care. The migrating birds returned while they were memorizing the precise timing required for succession planting of beans. The trading expeditions appeared on the horizon while they were practicing the calculations needed to determine how much seed to hold in reserve. The seed keeper realized that she would have to make the most difficult choice of her long career. She could not delay planting while her students completed their education. The growing season was too short, the margin for error too small. But she also could not trust critical decisions to people whose knowledge was still incomplete. She would have to remain actively involved in every aspect of the agricultural cycle, even though she had hoped to begin stepping back by this point in her life. As the spring planting began, the seed keeper found herself working 18-hour days. She supervised the preparation of fields, guided the selection of planting sites, and personally oversaw the handling of the most precious seed varieties. She worked alongside her students, teaching by example, hoping that repetition and observation would accelerate their learning in ways that words alone could not. But the physical demands were enormous. The seed keeper was no longer young, and the accumulated stress of the winter's crisis had taken its toll. She felt her strength flagging at precisely the moment when her community needed her most. The irony was cruel in her desperate attempt to ensure continuity. She was pushing herself to the point of collapse. The planting season progressed with agonizing precision. Every day brought new decisions that required her direct involvement. Which fields should receive the drought-resistant corn varieties? How should they adjust planting patterns to account for the early spring? Where should they locate the experimental plots where new seed varieties were tested? Each choice had ramifications that would echo through the entire growing season and beyond. Through it all, the seed keeper felt the weight of her impossible burden. She could not die, not yet, not until her knowledge had been fully transferred. But she also could not live forever, and with each passing day she felt more keenly the inadequacy of the time she had left. Her students were learning quickly, but agricultural wisdom could not be compressed into a single season. It required years of experience with different weather patterns, different challenges, different successes and failures. As summer approached and the planted seeds began to emerge from the earth, the seed keeper allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. The plantings looked strong, the weather patterns seemed favorable, and her students were beginning to demonstrate real understanding of the principles she had taught them. Perhaps with careful planning and a few more seasons of intensive training, she could actually succeed in transferring her knowledge before time ran out. But the universe had other plans. In the 7th week of summer, as the corn reached knee-height and the beans began their climb up the stalks, a message arrived that turned the seed keeper's world upside down. Traders from the eastern settlements brought news of strange pale men who had appeared across the great water, men who spoke languages no one understood and carried weapons that killed from impossible distances. These strangers, the traders reported, were demanding gold and silver, showing no interest in the agricultural wisdom that formed the foundation of civilized life. The seed keeper listened to these reports with growing dread. She had heard stories from her grandmother about times when entire ways of life had vanished, when communities had been scattered by warfare or disease. But this felt different, more final. These strangers, according to the traders, seemed to have no understanding of the delicate relationships between land, crops, and people that sustained civilization. They appeared to view the earth itself as something to be conquered rather than cultivated. That night, alone in her storage chambers, the seed keeper made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just months before. She would begin creating hidden caches of seeds and knowledge scattered throughout the region, insurance against the unthinkable possibility that everything she had worked to preserve might be lost to forces she could not control or comprehend. Working in secret, she began selecting her most trusted seeds, not just the varieties that produced the highest yields, but those with the greatest genetic diversity, the broadest adaptability, the strongest resistance to disease and weather extremes. These seeds, she decided, would be buried in carefully chosen locations, marked by signs that only her successors would understand. Even if the worst happened, even if the entire community was scattered or destroyed, someone in the future might find these caches and begin rebuilding what was lost. The task consumed her nights. She created detailed maps on specially prepared bark scrolls, noting not just the locations of the seed caches, but the specific conditions required for each variety to thrive. She included instructions for reading weather patterns, for identifying the subtle signs that predicted good or poor growing years, for managing soil fertility across decades of cultivation. Each cache became a complete library of agricultural knowledge, compressed into a form that could survive underground for generations. But the physical work of creating these caches was only part of the burden. The seed keeper found herself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. If the existing order was about to be swept away, what responsibility did she have to preserve knowledge that might no longer be relevant? If the strangers from across the water brought entirely different ways of life, would the agricultural wisdom she had spent her lifetime perfecting become obsolete? The questions haunted her as she continued the intensive training of her successors. She began teaching them not just the traditional methods passed down through generations, but new techniques for hiding knowledge, for preserving seeds in secret, for maintaining agricultural practices in the face of disruption and chaos. They had to be prepared not just for normal challenges like drought or floods, but for the possibility that their entire world might change in ways they could not predict. As summer progressed into its peak growing season, the seed keeper found herself monitoring not just the health of her crops, but the mood of her community. People had heard the traders' stories, and fear was beginning to spread. Some advocated preparing for war, strengthening defenses, gathering weapons. Others suggested sending diplomatic missions to these strangers, trying to establish peaceful relations. A few recommended retreating deeper into the interior, abandoning the river valleys that made their agriculture possible in favor of remote highlands where they might remain hidden. The seed keeper understood that each of these strategies had agricultural implications. War would disrupt planting and harvesting schedules, potentially causing food shortages even if the fighting remained distant. Diplomatic missions would require surplus crops as gifts, reducing the reserves she had worked so carefully to build. Retreat to the highlands would mean abandoning the fertile soils that made their complex society possible, forcing them to revert to simpler, more precarious ways of life. But there was another possibility that she found even more troubling. What if the strangers brought with them plants and animals that would fundamentally alter the agricultural landscape? She had heard rumors of four-legged beasts larger than deer, creatures that could carry heavy loads and pull implements through soil. There were stories of strange grains that grew differently than corn, of fruits and vegetables that no one had seen before. If these stories were true, they suggested that the entire foundation of agricultural knowledge she had spent her life preserving might be rendered obsolete by new and more productive alternatives. The thought was both terrifying and fascinating. The seedkeeper had dedicated her existence to perfecting agricultural systems based on the plants and animals available in her world. But what if there were better options she had never imagined? What if the knowledge she carried, precious as it was, represented only a fraction of what was possible? These questions tormented her through the long summer nights as she continued her frantic preparations. She expanded the number of hidden caches, scattering them across a wider geographic area. She began training her successors, not just in traditional agriculture, but in the art of adapting to changing circumstances, teaching them to think like experimenters and innovators rather than mere guardians of inherited wisdom. The harvest season arrived with unusual abundance. The weather had been nearly perfect, the soil conditions ideal, the balance of rainfall and sunshine almost precisely calibrated to maximize yields. The three sisters had performed magnificently, producing surplus crops that would support not only the local community but extensive trade networks. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a time of celebration, a validation of all the seedkeepers' careful planning and accumulated knowledge. But these were not normal circumstances. As the harvest wagons filled with corn, beans, and squash, the seedkeeper felt an overwhelming sense of impending loss. She was looking at what might be the last harvest of its kind, the final expression of an agricultural tradition that stretched back countless generations. Everything she saw around her, the precisely planned fields, the elaborate storage facilities, the complex social arrangements built around seasonal labor, might soon become as obsolete as the morning mist. The trading expeditions that arrived for the harvest festival brought more disturbing news. The pale strangers had established permanent settlements along the eastern coasts. They were bringing with them not just new technologies but new diseases that devastated communities with no natural resistance. Entire villages had been abandoned, their populations either dead or scattered. The complex trade networks that connected communities across the continent were beginning to break down as fear and suspicion replaced the trust built up over generations. The seedkeeper realized that her crisis was no longer simply about preserving agricultural knowledge for the next generation. She was racing against the collapse of the entire world that knowledge was designed to serve. The strangers represented more than just political or military threats. They were harbingers of a completely different way of organizing human relationships with the land and with each other. In the face of this overwhelming uncertainty, she made a final, desperate decision. She would create one ultimate cache, containing not just seeds and practical knowledge, but a complete record of the philosophical principles that underlay her people's approach to agriculture. This cache would include detailed descriptions of the spiritual relationships between humans and plants, the ceremonies and rituals that marked the agricultural calendar, the social structures that ensured fair distribution of both labor and harvest. This final cache would be more than practical insurance. It would be a message to the future, a testament to ways of thinking about land and life that might otherwise be lost forever. She would include not just instructions for growing specific crops, but explanations of why those crops were chosen, how they fit into larger ecological and social systems, what values and priorities shaped the decisions of countless generations of agricultural innovators. Creating this comprehensive record required her to articulate knowledge that had always been tacit, to put into words relationships and understandings that had never needed verbal explanation. She found herself writing about the spiritual dimension of seed selection, the emotional bonds between cultivators and their plants, the deep satisfaction that came from participating in cycles of growth and renewal that connected her generation to all those who had come before and all those who might come after. As winter approached once again, the seed keeper completed her final cache and sealed it in a location known only to her. She had done everything in her power to preserve not just the practical knowledge needed for survival, but the deeper wisdom that gave that knowledge meaning and purpose. If the worst happened, if her entire world disappeared, someone in the distant future might find these records and understand not just how her people had lived, but why they had chosen to live that way. The burden she had carried for so many years remained, but it had changed in character. She was no longer simply responsible for preserving existing knowledge. She had become responsible for creating a bridge between the world that was ending and whatever world might emerge to replace it. She truly was the woman who could never die, not because death was impossible, but because the consequences of her death extended far beyond her own lifetime. In her dreams, she saw vast fields of corn stretching to the horizon, tended by people she would never meet, nourished by wisdom she had fought to preserve. The future harvests of an entire continent still depended on her success, but now she understood that success might take forms she could never have imagined. The seeds were planted, the knowledge was hidden. The future, whatever it might bring, would have to grow from what she had managed to preserve.